With an Oxford PhD and a Harvard Medical School MD in the works, what does a young whiz kid like Nick Norwitz know about nutrition that the mainstream medical community seems to overlook? Nick stands as an amazing advocate for the carnivore diet because he's challenging the narrative surrounding meat. With his distinguished academic background, one might wonder, why would he embrace a diet that most people consider unhealthy? In our conversation, we will delve into how his education shaped his views, the evidence that supports his stance, and the unspoken truths about meat that many in the medical field might hesitate to share. We will also be addressing in detail the viral article that blew up on the internet about the man with the yellow nodules, also known as xanthelasma. Nick will be breaking that article down in this video. And finally, we will be exploring the future of nutritional science and whether the carnivore diet is here to stay or if it's just the latest health scam. Get ready to think twice because honestly, I wasn't ready for what Nick had to say. Welcome, Nick. Do introduce yourself first.
Thanks, Bella. Happy to be here. My name is Nick Norwitz. I'm a Boston-based PhD researcher in metabolic health science and a fourth-year medical student at Harvard. My academic background was an undergraduate degree in cell bio and biochemistry at Dartmouth before going to Oxford to do my PhD, and now I'm finishing up my MD over at Harvard. Along the way, I got drawn into the metabolic health space through a personal struggle with inflammatory bowel disease, for which a ketogenic diet was really effective. That drew my curiosity, and the rest is history. I can monologue about all that for 3 hours, but I'll try to keep it concise for this one.
I love your YouTube channel and Instagram page because you never stray away from speaking truth. You are so bold in your videos, and I love it. I also love how you're young and so passionate about health, diet, and wellness as well. So we have a lot of things in common. I would love to start off with the article on xanthelasma. I'm sure you have gotten a lot of buzz around it. Could you first start off by explaining what this article covered and then share your thoughts on it?
So there was a case report that came out in JAMA Cardiology, which is considered to be a pretty reputable journal. And the headlines were all running that man went on a carnivore diet and that cholesterol was oozing from his skin. So the pictures that were going around are these the cholesterol deposits in this man's hands, which is a real condition. However, to be blunt, the case report was a complete embarrassment, one of the worst things I've ever read, and read more like a Monty Python skit than an actual medical case report. So it was behind a paywall. So I think a lot of people didn't realize what it actually was. But the type of report it was it was under the category cardiovascular images, only 150 words. But the report read, first, man in his 40s. That was the entire description of the patient. So no medical, genetic, family, cardiovascular, or other history, which even for a 150-word report is, I think, a little bit sketchy, and then made some absurd claims, like the fact that he was eating 6 to 9 pounds of beef, butter, and cheese daily, which is just not plausible. Like Sean Baker could not eat 6 to 9 pounds of beef, butter, and cheese daily. It's like the lower threshold of his possible caloric intake will be like 96 ounces of steak per day and consistently for 8 months. So like, unless you're the fat man from Monty Python, this is not plausible. And you could tell from the hands of this man that he wasn't. So, without legitimate like patient details or, more patient details and making claims like that, it's already a little bit suspicious. I do not think the people that were reporting did their due diligence. I was really surprised JAMA Cardiology let it get published. So, I rendered my criticisms. I've also reached out to JAMA Cardiology and the first author twice with no response. I do want to highlight, I do not think any one diet fits everyone. I do not think any one diet is a panacea. I do not deny the fact that some people can have genetic contraindications that the xanthelasma condition could arise in a carnivore diet. That is not my concern. My concern is that the report as written, I think, lacked all intellectual honesty and integrity, and nevertheless, it was published in JAMA Cardiology. And this is part of a pattern. I can give you other examples where there's a very low bar, a very low intellectual standard in order to get hit pieces published against low carbohydrate diets, carnivore diets, meat-based diets. Again, I can go through examples recently from the journal Neurology or a prior report in Circulation, another prestigious cardiovascular journal, that was a flat-out lie about lean mass hyperresponders. So because it's part of a pattern, because I detected very low intellectual standards, I decided to call it out.
Well, Nick, what I liked about that article was the last time I saw a case xanthomas like that. It was probably early 1990s when I was in clinical practice, and I was working at a free clinic, and a longstanding diabetic who hadn't been seen by a doctor for like 4 years came into this free clinic I was volunteering time at. I did a blood sugar on it. It was too high to measure. And I could just tell things were going downhill. So I admitted him to the intensive care at our local hospital, and his blood sugar was 640. His cholesterol was 1,200 and his triglycerides were 16,000. It took me about 12 hours to get his blood sugar under control, and he wasn't in ketoacidosis. But to leave out the metabolic statement of your patient that you were talking about, I agree with you, is very misleading, because I assume that this person had really bad insulin resistance based on my own experience. And it would have been nice to know that. I'm so glad that you took time to dispel that and show for how incomplete it was and misleading.
So I actually want to, what you said really resonated with me, and I want to build off of it because, what you just described was an interesting and rare case. And how did you respond? You responded with curiosity, like, why is this patient an outlier? And what can we learn about this? One, to help this individual patient, and then two, to identify potential contraindications for a given intervention so you can help future people. And
Yeah.
so what I would hope with this case of the xanthelasmas was that the doctors would be like, okay, this is bizarre. Let's do our due diligence first to actually, collect a legitimate and viable case history. If you're reporting and the author got on Fox News and doubled down on the fact that they did intend to write 6 to 9 pounds of beef, cheese, and eggs per day. So first of all, like if you just take 2 seconds to think about it, it's not
Yeah.
plausible. They're clearly not thinking about it. But like, why wouldn't you be like, okay, this is interesting. Let me get a full metabolic workup, a medical history. Let's get some genetic tests. In fact, in my email to the first author, I said, look, I think this is incomplete. However, if you're willing to do a follow-up, I will help you write it. I will help you get it published. And if you want to do genetic testing, we can do it at my expense. So I'm not trying to just play carnivore defender for the sake of it. It's like any good doctor or scientist should say what's going on here and try to delve into it rather than trying to use it as a scare tactic, which is what I saw
Yeah.
here. Would you agree?
Yeah.
If you're loving Nick's answers as much as I am and want to ask him your personal questions, he'll be coming to the Steak and Butter Gang community as a guest speaker to answer all the member questions. In addition to Dr. Nick Norwitz, I will also be inviting on Dr. Anthony Chafee, Dr. Sean Baker, Dr. Tony Hampton, Dr. Robert Kiltz, Coach Rebecca Heichman, and our fantastic team of carnivore coaches. For over 4 years now, the Steak and Butter Gang has set the gold standard for being a one-stop shop for all things carnivore. And by joining us, you'll have immediate access to our amazing carnivore course that I have created with Dr. Sean Baker, weekly carnivore meal plans, and daily meetings with my incredible carnivore coaches, as well as weekly guest Q&As with all of your favorite experts, including Dr. Nick. Nick and I can't wait to see you in the community soon. To sign up for the next 30-day carnivore challenge, just go to sbgmeetup.com as shown on the screen. I've also included a clickable link down below in the description box.
Yeah, and it's hard to overcome the dogma. When I first went carnivore, my cholesterol numbers were all normal, but my LDL has gone up quite a bit. And the first thing my cardiologist did was give me an article on what he called increased mortality due to low carb diets. And I read it, and it wasn't even a low carb diet. It was 30 to 40% carbohydrate diet.
Yeah.
And they were looking at mortality in that group. And I said, well, this has nothing to do with what I'm doing. So, and he said, well, but that's why we don't prescribe low carb diets. And I said, well, that's not a low carb diet. So how are you justifying your medical dogma
Right.
of saying this is why you don't condone them based on an article that has nothing to do with what I'm doing?
Well, I think that's very common. And I was actually giving a talk at the Citizen Science Conference last weekend, and I was talking about what I called, let me see if this resonates with each of you, co-evolution of cliques. The talk was about how social media and science are kind of co-evolving, and what I see with respect to the literature that I was just talking about, say the Jamma cardiology, but also social media, is that like it is an engagement game, right? So you have JAMA Cardiology putting out this stuff and they're getting positive reinforcement because they're getting a lot of clicks and their journal's getting attention.
Right.
But also, by the same token, you have influencers leaning into that. So the example you just brought to mind, I don't know if you know who Lane Norton is, but he's a big time, let's say, personality in the health and fitness space. And just he went out of his way to say you shouldn't do a carnivore diet. Here's why. Cites 2 meta-analyses, one a meta, one a Cochrane review. The threshold for carbs in those meta and Cochrane were 40 and 45% kilocalories from carbs to be low carb. So even taking 40%, which is a lower limit, and saying somebody's only eating 2,000 calories, you could literally eat an apple cider donut, chocolate frosted donut, brownie batter donut, and 6 munchkins from Dunkin' Donuts and still be low carb each day.
Yeah.
So it's ridiculous because people tend not to do their due diligence. I would say physicians and scientists, and when communicating, if they want to make a point and don't really think through the parameters of the study. I'll give you another example. There was just an article that came out in Neurology. This was a full article, and it was saying that there's a relationship between red meat intake and dementia. The headlines were running that, like, just, some of them were just like, red meat is bad for the brain. Now, of course, this is a large-scale epidemiology trial with healthy user bias, all the normal caveats. Some other things to point out, unprocessed red meat intake had no association with dementia whatsoever. So it was only processed, not unprocessed, which is important. And then, and this is where I think things get the most interesting, is I don't discount epidemiology just for the sake of it being epidemiology. But if you want to tell a story, right, you need biological plausibility. You just say, well, why does this make sense? Like, what is the mechanism by which, say, red meat will be bad for the brain? And you go to their discussion section, and it's all non-specific to like processed versus unprocessed red meat. And again, remember, unprocessed red meat was not associated with dementia. And then they tried to throw saturated fat under the bus. So they have a statement, and I go over this in a video I did recently, where they're like, saturated fat is bad for the brain because it decreases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is important for the brain. What do you think the study they were citing was? I think it was reference 34, and it was a mouse study. Mouse studies are fine, but the diet in question was an HFS diet, which stood for high-fat sucrose diet. So literally, the publication in Neurology was citing a mouse study where the saturated fat-rich diet was a high-fat sucrose diet in mice. And, like, people think, if you're not, I'm sure, you've published your fair share of papers, Dr. Smith, but if you're not in the academic world, you think of peer review as something that is a meritocracy and a little bit more watertight. It's like, no, there's unpaid humans on the other end that are going to pass through what they want to pass through. So people aren't checking every reference. And yeah, if you have a big name team going to a big journal with something that could be a big headline, nobody's going to look at that reference and find out, oh, the whole basis of, their argument around negative effects of saturated fat was one reference, and they were referencing mice eating sugar.
Yeah.
I do want to point out, this is a pattern. This isn't just like a one-off in JAMA Cardio. We had there was a paper on circulation. It was either 2024 or 2023, but this was when we started publishing a lot of work on lean mass hyperresponders. For those who don't know, that's a phenotype that myself and colleagues Dave Feldman, Adrian Sotomoto have been studying when lean people go low carb and their cholesterol goes through the roof. Their LDL goes up, their HDL goes up, and their triglycerides are low. Bella, I guess you're probably in that category. Am I correct?
I have very high LDL, fantastic HDL, very low triglycerides on carnivore.
What are your HDL and triglyceride numbers, if I may ask?
Yeah, HDL's 98, triglycerides 15, my LDL's 264.
Yeah, so you qualify as a lean mass hyperresponder. The cutoffs are 200 LDL and above, 80 HDL and above, 70 triglycerides and below. Now, let me be clear. In people not low carb, this is incredibly rare. And in people who have obesity, this is also incredibly rare. We even have a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials on this topic. So pretty high level evidence. We can get there if we want. But the point I was trying to make is we start publishing this work. Then this top cardiology journal, Circulation, publishes a case report. And you can look it up. It read something to the effect of rapid progression. I think this is the exact title: rapid progression of CAD, which is coronary artery disease, after stopping a statin and starting a ketogenic diet in a phenotypic lean mass hyperresponder. So the title is claiming this patient had rapid progression of heart disease after stopping a statin and starting a ketogenic diet. Oh, and by the way, he's a lean mass hyperresponder. You read the report, guess what? First of all, he's not a lean mass hyperresponder. That was, a mischaracterization. Let's set that aside because that's not even the big deal. The case read that this was a person with a strong family history of cardiovascular disease who had a coronary disease and near complete blockage of his left anterior descending artery, one of the major vessels in the heart. This is before he went keto, well before he went keto. They went in there, did something called a percutaneous intervention. So basically, they're like going in his heart, they're probably stenting open this vessel because it's already clogged up. Again, he's not keto by this point. They then put him on a statin. Oh, and by the way, when they were in there, presumably opening up that left vessel, they noticed, oh, his right vessel already has moderate disease. So we'll give him standard secondary prevention, statin therapy. Then they let him off into the world, during which time they do not track his progression whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And then at some point, he tries a ketogenic diet, which is not defined, just patient reported. He might have just eaten bacon, on top of his normal diet. And they don't give a duration. So it could have been a week. And then they note more disease in his right artery. So the timeline is this patient already has severe disease, basically blockage of his left artery, totally on a mixed diet. He goes off into the year, for years, 2 years to be exact, with standard statin therapy, during which he's not progressed. Then he tries a ketogenic diet without definition or duration, and they blame the rapid progression of heart disease on the ketogenic diet, and then they label him a lean mass hyperresponder incorrectly. So there's multiple levels of lies, and this gets passed in the journal circulation. And because of the type of report it was, I and colleague cardiologists weren't even allowed to write a letter to the editor. We weren't allowed to write an e-letter. So I had written it, and they were like, wouldn't even entertain it. I just posted it on Twitter. So there are so many examples and levels of just really low intellectual standards coming after fringe diets. So I'm not trying to say that there is the RCT that should make a carnivore diet standard of care. I'm saying there's a huge bias against even investigating the question. And that is anti-scientific and does not do a service to patients who could potentially benefit. So that's why I get on my high horse about this, not because I think broccoli is a conspiracy theory or fiber is bad for you, but because if you want to be an honest intellectual, you need to pursue these questions, and I see major blocks. And all these examples that I just brought up, neurology, circulation, Jamma cardiology, are clear examples of blockades to investigating science.
You said you had inflammatory bowel disease. So which one did you have, and what was your journey with that?
Ulcerative colitis. I started developing ulcerative colitis in my early 20s.
Okay.
First symptoms arose around age 21 while I was in college. Manifestations were typical for ulcerative colitis, so lots of bloody diarrhea. Mm-hmm. The type of urgency that you just can't hold in if you haven't felt blood pooling in your colon is the most uncomfortable feeling that I can imagine. And it really struck me, not just with physical deterioration, but really psychological torture, social withdrawal, anything that you'd want to think about engaging in socially, it's very difficult to do when you might have a flare at any given moment. Yep. It really peaked when I started grad school at Oxford, at which point I started having uncontrollable flares, lost a lot of body weight, and ended up in ICU level care. So after trying medications that didn't work, I just started rifling through diets and trying many different diets quite rigorously, at least for a month a pop. So, paleo, Whole30, Mediterranean, vegetarian, vegan, what have you. The standard, so low FODMAP, specific carbohydrate diet, things like that. And nothing really stuck or helped. And I got to the point where I just had on my list to cross off a ketogenic diet, because why not? I had nothing to lose. And in about a week, I had massive symptom improvements and a big reduction in my inflammatory markers. There have been some blips. My gastrointestinal health isn't perfect. It will, I don't think, ever be perfect, but it allowed me to get out of the hospital, finish my PhD, and basically, in a couple months, complete my MD. It really brought me back to life. I will clarify, I did not start a carnivore ketogenic diet. The way I thought of I thought to make it healthy at the time was, lots of fish, leafy green vegetables, lots of olive oil, actually pretty low saturated fat. And a couple things I want to emphasize there. One, that was sufficient for me. So I didn't need carnivore. Some other people seem to need carnivore, different strokes for different folks. But two, I mentioned this cholesterol phenomenon, or very high LDL. one of the things I'd like to point out with respect to low carb diets is the driving factor of the exorbitantly high LDL that myself, and it sounds like Bella has, tends to be generally when you're lean and insulin sensitive, not saturated fat. So even though I was eating a very low saturated fat diet, basically no meat or dairy, my LDL went to in the 300s. And the highest my LDL has ever been, which is 545, was when I actually was on a diet that was only 15% fat as saturated fat and 85% as unsaturated fat. And the reason I think my LDL was so high at that point is because I was actually trying to tweak things in order to bring down my LDL. That included cutting out saturated fat sources. I lost a little bit of weight, got even leaner, and my LDL went up. And actually, that's happened with other people. Dave Feldman's story, if people know him, it was similar, where he got this report back and his LDL was through the roof. And so he had all this anxiety and he just wasn't eating because he was so nervous. And he decided, he'll get another test, but he's like, okay, I've been torn up, but at least because I've been torn up, I haven't really been eating much. So my fat intake's gone way down. My saturated fat intake's gone way down. So we expected his LDL to drop, but because he got leaner, his LDL went up. This has actually happened quite a few times with many different people. So in terms of the physiologic drivers of high LDL and low carb, it's saturated fat can move the needle a little bit, but if you have the really high levels, it's typically because you're lean and insulin sensitive.
I've certainly seen a lot of 20-year-olds get their entire colon removed from ulcerative colitis. And there's two reasons. One, you get to the point where you get anemic, you get such involvement that you get toxic, and then the third risk factor is you can get colon cancer as a result. So do you think you were in that category, that you were close to heading towards what we call a colectomy, which is removing your colon?
I will say my symptoms were bad enough that I was raising the possibility with my physicians. Just because the quality of life was that bad. For me, I only suffered for 2 years. Now, 2 years feels like a lifetime when you're suffering like that. But in the, let's say, universe of patient histories, generally I don't want to say let people suffer more, but you take more time, you experiment with more things before going full colectomy, because obviously you take out a colon, you can't put it back. And there can be complications. So I would say I knew that was a possibility, and I was actually asking for it at a point in time because I was so desperate. But medically speaking, it was not being recommended. No.
Okay. And how did the gastroenterologist respond to your remission?
I took responsibility for my own health. I tried some experimental, which she could not recommend because there aren't rigorous trials on that. Like, you could see I was healthier, and he was happy for that. Ever since then has been, receptive to my input, and I've been receptive to his. So it's been a very good relationship. I won't say he, became a keto evangelist and started running multi-million-dollar trials, but I think one can only hope for so much. So maybe that'll be my job to get those trials funded one day.
And while most doctors today are still resistant to carnivore diet, the ones that do believe in the power of meat will tell you how important it is to monitor your electrolyte levels. When your body hasn't yet adapted to a meat-only diet, making sure you're upping your potassium, magnesium, and sodium levels can really help with those nasty adaptation symptoms. For example, headaches, muscle cramping, lower energy than usual. That's why it could be essential for new and adapting carnivores to rely on a high-quality electrolyte supplement. This is the one that I recommend. It's from the brand Element, and specifically this teal-colored box. It's labeled raw unflavored. This one specifically never contains stevia, sugar, or any additives, except for the 3 electrolytes our bodies need in quantities that have already been measured out for you. Now, if you're sensitive to store-bought electrolytes, I have shown you how to make them yourself at home in a recent recipe video that you can find here. I've also linked it down below. If you're one of those carnivores that is always in a pinch for time, or you just don't want to go through the trouble, Element is a great option. Here's what the packets look like. You just rip one open, pour in whatever you're drinking, mix it up, drink it up, and you're good to go. You all can get a free sample pack with any purchase if you go to the URL shown on the screen, drinkelement.com/SBGAL. Also link them down below. So Nick, I was vegan for 6 years, destroyed my health, lost my period, didn't help my skin issues. I'm actually curious to hear if the vegan diet helped with your ulcerative colitis.
It did not. I'll leave it at that. And that's one trial I would really love to get going. A carnivore versus a whole food plant-based vegan RCT for inflammatory bowel disease. I think we'd see one group stand out above the other very quickly. We just need to get that funded. And this is one of those kind of trials where I would love a team of, quote, rivals. You know what I mean? Like Chris Gardner at Stanford can design the whole food plant-based diet. It's pretty interesting to see how they decided to design the animal-based low-carb diet, which is like all you can eat roasted salted nuts and peanuts, like fried chicken on salad, and like it absolutely looks like off-putting. It looks like the worst salad you can imagine from McDonald's or Wendy's, plus like roasted salted peanuts. I'm like, how is this an animal-based ketogenic diet? Like, who designed this? This is ridiculous. That's besides the point. The trial results are invalid for another reason. They designed it quite poorly. But in the literature, it's not uncommon to have, I think, one group or both groups poorly designed. And in a sort of trial where one compared like a carnivore diet to a vegan diet, like I'd want both designed the best they could possibly be.
Can I share some lab results and have your thoughts? As you can see, on one side, it's my vegan numbers. And I measured this when I was vegan, completely whole foods, plant-based vegan, no junk foods, for 6 years. Those were my numbers there. And then the right side, carnivore now, I'm 6 years in. I'm a very high fat carnivore. I like to say, eat as much fat as I want. It's just so good for my hormones, I've seen. When I share these numbers, whether on YouTube or Instagram, there is always so much hate surrounding on, well, look at her, just look at her LDL, her cholesterol. As a carnivore, she is killing herself.
So before we get to the lipids, let's just go over the other things quickly. Your fasting glucose on vegan was not high, like an 84 is perfectly normal. 66, like 84 to 66 could be, I'm just going to say to, steelman vegan in the, normal variability, normal fluctuation. So I'm not going to make much of that. B12 is quite striking. Your B12 was definitely on the lower end on vegan. That's not surprising. There aren't many plant-based sources of B12. So most people who go vegan, I think it's pretty common to supplement. I will say there are one or two vegan foods that can be high in B12, like I think golden chanterelle mushrooms, but generally hard to get B12 on a vegan diet, not hard on an animal-based diet, so those results aren't surprising. HSCRP of 0.3 on carnivore, that's very low, so a general marker of inflammation, quite low. A1C on vegan is on the higher end. 5.7 is the pre-diabetic range. 5.5 for a healthy person is like, okay, maybe you're creeping up there. It would have been interesting to see an insulin level, because typically in the development of insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you'll see the insulin jump up, or the HOMA-IR score, which is a measure of insulin resistance, trend poorly before you see the A1C jump, because that's the point at which your pancreas generally isn't keeping up or can't compensate by pumping out enough insulin to keep up with insulin resistance. 4.7 on carnivore is pretty low. It's interesting. We can talk more about this. On carnivore, there does appear to be a diversity in A1Cs, with some people actually seeing an increase in A1C. Your triglycerides are particularly low on carnivore. They weren't that high to begin with. Like a 97 isn't considered concerning. As for the LDL and the HDL, your HDL was pretty high at baseline. It's gone up on a low-carb diet, which is consistent with what we see in the literature, and your LDL is obviously skyrocketed. So I'm not surprised people tend to focus on the LDL, since it's a very famous or infamous marker of cardiovascular risk. What I would say, to boil this all down, is that I'm not going to discount that LDL is a risk factor. I'm not even going to discount that LDL particles, or ApoB, which is the lipoprotein associated with these particles, are causal, heavy quotes, for cardiovascular disease or an independent risk factor. The thing I would really emphasize is that the risk associated with high LDL or high ApoB, even if you consider it, quote, causal, is context dependent. So a given LDL exposure in one person won't translate into plaque accumulation the same as it will in another person. There's quite a bit of literature on this. Some derive from people with like genetic familial hypercholesterolemia as compared to like matched levels of LDL in people without genetic causes. But context really matters. And so we know there are some patients with super high LDL, and if you look in their vessels with like coronary CT angiography, they just don't have plaque. And so more and more, I think the literature is trending towards, well, get functional testing and let that guide your individual, decision making. So it's not to say shrug off an LDL of 200s or 300s, even if your HDL and triglycerides are, quote, good, but it's to say, okay, let's do one's due diligence, maybe get some cardiovascular imaging, say a CCTA, which looks at not just calcified plaque, but non-calcified plaque as well, and then make a risk determination there. We are doing research on people like you and me, lean mass hyperresponders, which, and I will be very clear about this, the only population ever studied to date that has high LDL in the context of good metabolic health and no known genetic dysfunction. So most populations we study, metabolically unhealthy, that's a different category. Or if you have, like Brown and Goldstein studied familial hypercholesterolemia, broken LDL receptors from birth. Messed up genetics and broken LDL receptors is very different from a metabolic response, which I think is what we're seeing here. So this is the first time in history we're studying people like you and me. And what we've seen in the early data is no increase in cardiovascular plaque accumulation. We have the baseline data from a study being run out of the Lundquist Institute, where people, lean mass hyperresponders and near lean mass hyperresponders with LDL averaging 272 were compared to a matched cohort with LDL average 123. For about 4.7 years was the LDL delta. That's how long people have been on the keto diet. And there was no increase in plaque on coronary CT angiography. In fact, the lean group who was keto with higher LDL was actually trending to lower plaque levels. We have a paper under review now. I will say I can't speak to the data, but it's in the final stage of a review where we're looking prospectively at this population to see if plaque progressed. But in that initial study, there was no more plaque in the high LDL, lean mass hyperresponder, animal-based keto generally diet group, and no association between LDL levels and plaque. So like within that group, there were people with LDLs of 200 and 591. The people at the 591 LDL level had no more plaque than those at the lower end of the spectrum. So no increased plaque accumulation and no association between LDL or ApoB actually and plaque levels or progression. I can say that now. Context matters. That's
Absolutely.
the headline. Context matters.
For those who
Yeah.
are on a carnivore diet, what test can they take to make sure there's no plaque accumulation?
So coronary CT angiography will be the best bet. I would go to Metabolic Mind. Brett Scher, who I'm sure you know, a cardiologist, did a review of the 2 functional tests you can get and did their pros and cons. It was a great video, so I recommend people look at that. It was a CAC, coronary artery calcium scan, and a coronary CT angiography. So I'll just refer you there. I'll say high level, CCTA is going to pick up not just calcified plaque, but also non-calcified. But a CAC is pretty good, especially if you're like 50 and above. If you're 50 and above and your CAC is 0, that's a pretty good sign. The benefit to a CCTA is you see more, but there's also a little bit more radiation exposure, and it might be a little bit harder to access.
And to put that in lay term, the CAC is measuring the amount of calcium that's in your coronary arteries, where the CT angiography is actually looking at 3-dimensionally, looking at the presence of plaque in the coronary arteries. So it's more specific. It does require more radiation. It also requires a lot more definitive CT scanner, usually 256 slice, to get good imaging, and is a little more pricey. So it's not something you're going to do every year, but it is perhaps even better, more precise than doing coronary angiography, which is 2-dimensional compared to 3-dimensional of CT angiography.
Yeah, the imaging is getting pretty good. I would say right now, a lot of the like larger scale data is using CAC. And just functionally for the audience, like high level, what I would take away from the literature I've read is if you have a high CAC score and you have a lot of plaque, like plaque begets plaque, I would be cautious. Like, I'm not going to say people shouldn't take statins. I don't feel that at all. I'm just saying right tools and the right people. So if you have a high CAC score, I think it's best to be conservative and not gamble. But if your CAC is low or your CCTA shows no plaque, I think that's reassuring. So to give an N equals 1, that's kind of close to me, that I have permission to share my mother. She's had high cholesterol her whole life. LDL at kind of a baseline sits around 160, 180. And she's been keto for a while, so her LDL's been in the 400s because she's a lean mass hyperresponder. She's about to turn 60, and she's worried about her heart health. It's like, she's an MD PhD. She knows what these numbers tend to mean. So she ended up deciding to get a coronary CT angiography. It shows absolutely 0 plaque. So for her, at that stage of life, it was useful in making the determination of whether or not she wanted to take medication. She ended up deciding no, because she's had this huge exposure and it is not manifested in plaque. So had she found she has a lot of pre-existing plaque, she would have probably made drastic lifestyle changes and started a medication. So this is highly individual, but I would say where we have imaging data and functional tests, just get those rather than, guess about what a particular risk factor might mean.
When I was in practice back in the 90s, when we started doing lipid profiles, um, I had practicing in Florida. We had a lot of 80 and 90-year-olds in the practice, and it was amazing how many people with HDL cholesterols in the 90s would come in and they're perfectly healthy and not on any medications. So I used to tell them they had the Methuselah gene. And Methuselah was in the book of Genesis in the Bible, the oldest living human, lived 969 years. And they would always get a kick out of that. But I am impressed with anyone that has an HDL of 98.
Mine is 125.
I've never seen one over 100, Nick.
So,
awesome.
I'll actually send you some of my lab. So I will also clarify, because this is a kind of a, let's say, a nuanced note. If you look at the population literature, there's a U-shaped curve. So HDLs above 80 are actually considered, well, associated with worse outcomes. But the thing I want to hammer home here is the same thing as for the LDL. It's that the physiologic driver matters. So when you're looking at population level data, you can say, okay, there's many reasons HDL could go up. You could have HDL dysfunction versus, say, in me at baseline or in Bella, like our HDLs were below 80 when we were on a mixed diet, but then they responded when you went carbohydrate restriction, when you had carbohydrate restriction in order to increase. So again, it's very different than a genetic driver, or say like if you have alcohol abuse disorder, which also can drive up HDL. So like there are lots of reasons any of these biomarkers can change, and it's really, really important to take it in the context of like who is the patient and what might be driving this up. Which is also why I think that's such an important point. I've gone like above and beyond to try to demonstrate it by doing metabolic demonstrations, which you both or one of you might be aware of, in order to show if you understand the physiology, you can do incredible things, including, in one case, lowering my LDL cholesterol with Oreo cookies. Right. So that was an experiment I did that I published on with the senior author is Professor William Cromwell, the lipidologist, over 30 years experience, trained Thomas Dayspring, who trained Peter Attia. The people on the paper other than me knew what they were doing. And I was like, look, if I'm right about why the LDL is going up in me and presumably in Bella, it has to do with energy trafficking, because I'm low carb, I'm trafficking more fat fuel through the cholesterol system. So if I put carbs back into the system, the LDL should go down. So I did a pure carb addition. With 12 Oreo cookies per day for 16 days, my LDL dropped by 71%. I actually did it as a crossover trial with a 3-month washout period as compared to 20 milligrams of Crestor for 6 weeks. And the Oreos were twice as potent as the high-dose gorilla statin. I'm not saying Oreos are healthy. I'm not saying statins are bad. I'm not saying high DL is good or bad. I'm just saying, how weird is that? And it should provoke your curiosity to be like, okay, well, what's going on here? Because it provokes a cognitive dissonance. If you have a bad intervention, if we agree Oreo cookie hyperphagy is unhealthy, but we also think that lowering LDL is, quote, good, then how can you have a bad intervention that results in a good outcome? Yeah. It means there's something we don't understand. So understanding the physiology, the context is so, so important. I've had doctors at Harvard, actually last week, there was one of the residents that I was training with during my core rotations. She's a lean mass hyperresponder. She's like, I just got to do it. She was waiting until she finished her pregnancy to do it, but she did it and it worked. 1 week, her LDL dropped like 73. And I've had other doctors and people recapitulate this. In a clinical setting, I've had doctors use this physiology, but typically they'll use like fruits and, starches, which I think is a much better idea. But this seems to be a replicatable finding. So I did it so people could replicate it, and it's been replicated. So yes, it was a troll to get attention in a sense, but also like a legitimate troll based on like genuine science physiology. And in order to get people to talk about the body of literature, because like we published meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials, and people don't want to talk about them because it doesn't fit their narrative, or they don't want to invest the mental energy. So I'm going to force a discussion, and I have to do Oreo cookie experiments to do that, then fine, it works.
How are your colleagues at Harvard School of Medicine treating you?
I was really concerned, even before I was in social media. I wrote a piece, you can look it up in Stat News, where it's like, before I was matriculating, I'm like, Will a ketogenic diet make me a pariah in medical school? That was the name of the article, still out
Okay.
there. I have found people are so interested and receptive and get it. And I do think that's important to communicate, because what people tend to see, I'm sure your audience, is a lot of sniping back and forth among academics on social media.
Yeah.
But like behind closed doors, people are just like curious individuals. When you know someone as a person, you could sit down. Like my peers know I'm pretty thoughtful, that I'm willing to listen to them. They're willing to listen to me. They're like, this is so cool. And honestly, there are quite a lot of keto, intermittent fasting, and even carnivore medical students, residents, and even attendings at Harvard. They're just not vocal about it.
Got
I
Wow.
don't think I wouldn't say it's because they're like cowardly or anything. It's just like, every
Yeah.
person is passionate about a lot of different things, but you like choose the thing that you're going to really put
Sure.
all your force and effort into. And if you're just living a carnivore lifestyle because it makes you feel good, but you have to run a clinic like 80 hours a week, you just don't want to have to deal with that like headache in your life. And you're not going to get on social media. So like I do have like senior attendings text me, like that your neurology article I was talking about. I became aware of it because a senior doctor at one of the Harvard hospitals texted me and said, Nick, this is terrible. I'm like, I'm on it. And they don't then engage after the fact. But I actually get a lot of positive feedback and not really any negative. And I'll point out, even people who don't agree with me per se, or might not read the literature the same way, are pretty open and receptive to conversations. So some of your audience might know Professor Walter Willett, a very big name in the plant-based space. Like, I've been to his house. I was at his house getting filmed talking about the Oreo experiment. He was quite interested in it and open to the concept of lean mass hyperresponders. He didn't like say it was nonsense. He's like, this is interesting. It doesn't mean we have to agree on like, all things plant-based versus animal-based. But when it comes down to new discoveries, I actually have found that behind closed doors, people are very receptive.
Nick, I'm curious to know, so you're a young PhD student, you support a keto carnivore diet. What key insights do you believe are overlooked by mainstream medicine regarding diet's role in health?
Everything in the kitchen sink. I mean, as I was completing my PhD and starting medical school, it has been a long journey, but one of the things that really struck me and that I've internalized as I think a basic truth for why we practice the way we practice is it's about like incentive structures and business models. And we like this idea of practicing evidence-based medicine, but what does that actually mean? It means we look towards what we perceive as top-tier evidence, so like the rigorous randomized control trials, in order to prescribe given interventions. But here's the problem. To get those done requires a ton of money and investment, which in a pharmaceutical landscape is very clear. The business model is you invent a drug, you do a trial, you prescribe the drug, you make tons of money. That's not to say pills are bad by any means, or injections are bad. I don't think that's the case at all. They have their use case. It's just to acknowledge the incentive structure of why we have such a quote rigorous evidence base. Then you compare it to like, let's ask the question we asked before: could a carnivore diet work for inflammatory bowel disease? Based on the cases I've seen, many dozens, I'm very convinced that this could be a powerful intervention, maybe more powerful than any medication we have. And there's biological plausibility. But you ask the question, is it, quote, evidence-based in the same way that a lot of medications are? And the answer is no, not because it doesn't work, because who's given $10, $12 million to run that study? Not to mention then recruiting patients and having them adhere to the intervention, which is also a giant struggle. So it's a matter of not that people are closed off to it, but that the way we practice, prescribe, and the way that the research ecosystem is set up, it's not incentivizing doing the research that would be required to make this mainstream. So that's what I'm passionate about changing. Now, that presents a lot of challenges. And I think one is just addressing the cultural aspect, like pointing things out like, isn't it a little bit weird that we're bribing people to get immunized with like free donuts when high blood sugar, bad blood sugar control, and insulin resistance are like leading drivers for poor outcomes when you get respiratory viruses? I'm not naming the name for YouTube purposes, but you get what I'm saying. That's just dysfunctional. And it's dysfunctional that we like, feed patients what we feed them in the hospital. or, you know, even medical students, what we feed medical students in medical school. You'll have like a wellness session after you've been sleep deprived for forever and you're stressed out, and they're like, okay, you should get exercise and sleep, but you're going to be on a 24-hour rotation. And oh, by the way, here to make you feel better, some goat yoga and donuts and a pizza party. Like, that is the culture. People are trying to be nice, but that is the culture. We need to challenge those norms. And we also got to get good research funded, which is going to come down to, honestly, philanthropy and a grassroots movement, which is starting now, but it's a bit of a David and Goliath situation for the reasons I've explained. Like, the business model is not clear and there for funding these trials. This is something I'm actively working on. So
Awesome.
one thing I've disclosed recently is, after a long, hard thought, I've decided not to apply to residency, which basically everybody else in my class is doing. It's the thing you do, especially, you know, in my circles, especially when you've invested now the last 11 years of my life into undergrad, a PhD, and an MD. To kind of jump off and say, I'm not even going to go to residency is a big deal. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because I genuinely feel I could have more impact being a scientific educator publicly and using that profile in order to fund research. I've now been connected with like multiple billionaires who have actually given us some money to do trials, which we have designed and we'll start executing next year. So, you know, in order to get the $10 million, et cetera, I want for trials that I want to run, I need to use creative tactics. So at a high level, I think, you know, this is going to be a snowball effect. I'm very new in this, but after I graduate in May, I'll just tell you, I'm directing all my efforts in public education and also using that to get the kind of trials funded that I want to see. And honestly, there's a gravitational pull. Like, when you're out there talking of, you're right. You're talking about a money pool. Like, you know, one wealthy person will come forward, and, you know, offer some money, and then it will, you know, be a lever that I can, you know, pull with other wealthy people. But there's a lot coming down the pipeline, especially after big publicity moments, like we have a movie coming out probably in the fall about this research. I think that will stimulate a lot more interest. Hopefully Netflix or Amazon, I'm speculating, but we'll see. So it's a brave new world, and I'm kind of laying down the bricks ahead of me as I'm walking down the path. But I will say there are already philanthropists looking our way to fund this kind of research. I don't think the money's going to be coming from the NIH, at least not to me.
Bella probably doesn't understand when you complete your MD that you'll be what we call a paradox, 2 doctorate degrees.
I mean, it's a funny thing too, because like, you probably can already tell a little bit, but like, I don't stand on ceremony. I don't care if people call me doctor or like egg guy, some dude, Oreo kid. It doesn't matter to me. I don't care about the optics, like, you know, but I'm also a pragmatist. So like, I know the value of an Oxford PhD and a Harvard MD and that affiliation. And because the game is set the way it is, like, I don't mind using it. I knew Oreo cookie versus statin would work because I was a Harvard medical student. I knew the headlines would jump at that. Or, I mean, the reason that I, you know, media outlets cover me now, like, you know, setting my personal politics aside, Fox News decided to post my whole carnivore busting myth video to, you know, their website. Why? Because they could say Harvard scientist, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, so I saw it on Fox News.
Yeah. I think arguments should stand on their own. However, one needs to understand the game and play the game. So I'll do that. My degrees will have good optics and purpose, but at the end of the day, it's just like, I try to communicate the science as authentically as possible. And hopefully that will sway people more. And the, you know, the letters and affiliations will just be the clickbait to get them to listen to the data and arguments.
Bravo, Nick. Whatever you want to achieve, it is literally working. And when you shared that they love to headline it with, oh, Harvard scientist, they always write articles on me and say Juilliard concert pianist eats sticks of butter. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I saw we were both in the New York Post, like back to back, I think.
Literally same day.
Yeah, that's funny. That's fun. I mean, I love this is somewhat tangential, but there are pros and cons to social media. But one thing I love is how it can bring together people with such diversities of backgrounds. Like, my best friends now, Dave Feldman's like a software engineer from like another universe, or like I got connection with Dave Dana, which has such a remarkable story, but like completely different background. Or now talking to you, like, we converge because of some similar health journey, and, you know, And I don't think if we, lived 20 years ago, we would have ever crossed paths. And that's just so cool. And even in the health and nutrition space, like, I have my expertise based on my sensitivities, my areas of interest. So do you. But like, I genuinely like the thing I love about metabolic health is the proof is in the pudding, your end results. And if somebody
Mhm.
gets healthy, I really don't care how they got there. So it's great that I think there's an ecosystem of support for people doing animal-based low-carb diets. By the same token, I feel the same way about support systems and like, community networks for like, vegan diets. If somebody gets healthy, be on a low-fat, plant-based vegan diet, and that is their journey, I won't discredit that. And I'm super happy that there are people out there willing to support them. I think social media is really great for that. Like you can find your tribe, and I mean that in the positive way. Yes, there are
Absolutely.
ecosystems, in chambers, but like with lifestyle change in this world with all these like metabolic health booby traps, it's amazing to be able to find supportive communities who can say like, keep it up, you can do this and give you positive encouragement on your journey, provided you're actually trending in the right direction.
I got goosebumps just you talking about that because that's how I met Phil. And that's how I got so close to everyone on my team in the carnivore community as well. And I get to meet Phil in person where he lives in Tampa. We're going to speak all about carnivore diet at Hack Your Health. So the opportunities are endless if you just share your story online. And I'm very grateful to have met you, Nick. As someone who is on social media, a part of the carnivore community, I've been doing this lifestyle for 6 years. I always notice the horror stories, the hit stories go viral. So, how does one sift through all the information online and be able to know whether or not it's legitimate?
I think people should try to follow people who are not necessarily of like mind, which means when cautionary anecdotes do arise, I think we should weight them, just like we do anecdotes of benefit. I'm not saying we should have our selection bias towards what we just want to hear. That said, again, my issue is with double standards. So, for example, we've published multiple case reports and case series on carnivore diets for medical conditions. We had one on a carnivore diet for inflammatory bowel disease. Now, I just want to juxtapose what we wrote to what I just described. So, what I just described was basically an implausible n=1 with no supporting data really, other than those photos, but an implausible patient history and no real patient details. What we published was n=10 case series where every single patient had lab work, colonoscopy reports, validated questionnaires. It's called an IBDQ, looking at clinical remission. We had prospective dietary logs where people had like the gram weights of all the things they ate. And we did full medical histories with each patient. Ours, and you can look it up if you just type in carnivore for IBD, it will come up on PubMed, was far more comprehensive, far more legitimate, quite honestly, and nevertheless, it didn't hit the headlines. So to your point, Bella, there's a selection bias, I think, in the media and in academic publishing. I won't talk about the backstory behind all the headaches we had to go through to get this published, but in selecting out the negative. And the issue I have there, which I'll just elaborate on what I just said, is not that I mind cautionary tales, but the inevitable consequence of publishing stuff like the JAMA cardiology report, and we can go through more examples, is, I think, increasing the chasm of mistrust that exists between the general public and modern medicine. And I think that's very dangerous. I think people should go to their doctor, generally respect their doctor's input. However, even people without a medical or research background, they can tell when they're being patronized to, when they're having BS spewed at them. And when academic journals put out nonsense like this, and then medical doctors stand behind it or wave it as a cautionary flag, people will get the wiser to it, and then they'll feel like they're just getting gaslit, and there'll be this increasing chasm of trust at the fault of science and medicine, or science and medicine, air quotes, because I'm referring to the institution, not the process. Science is a process, not an institution.
I will wrap up with this last question. Where do you see the future of nutritional science heading? And is there anything that we as a community can do to help get the carnivore diet to be more accepted?
I think in general, nutrition science is headed more in an n=1 direction. So up to date, I like talk about this like hierarchy of evidence, rigorous evidence-based medicine is based on large scale, even randomized controlled trials, which have their strengths, but also have immense weaknesses because what you're necessarily doing is drawing on a large population of diverse individuals. So for example, you can run a drug trial and get statistically significant results while the drug actually helps a minority of people. It doesn't necessarily speak to how each individual responds. And with advances in biofeedback tools, things like continuous glucose monitors, but just like more advanced testing, I think medicine is going to trend, especially in nutrition science, towards more individualized approaches where we, iterate and inform practices based on individuals' biomarkers. I genuinely think in like 10 years, we will have longitudinal multiomics on everybody, which means like multiomics is multiple omes, so genome, transcriptome, proteome, microbiome, and then taking that over time to see like how your meta-organism, so you as an organism plus things like your microbiome, this like whole cluster of things changes with different interventions. You can imagine literally like a microbiome monitor in your toilet that has an app to your phone that connects to your doctor, and like the amount that we can gather from that kind of big data combined with machine learning, I think nutrition science is definitely going in the N=1 direction. As for carnivore diet and how we can have it be more accepted, as an example, I have a video on 8 myths about the carnivore diet. Look how I construct my arguments and what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. That was sufficient to get picked up by like major media networks because they're like, okay, like his arguments are actually watertight and legitimate. And I like attack the science. And also, this is a funny thing just in general in nutrition science, but always think about like, where is the burden of proof? So I don't need to say meat is like going to protect you against Alzheimer's disease. Somebody's going to take this out of context and say that I said that. I can already see that as a clip on the internet, but I'm not saying that. But I don't need to. All I need to do is shake confidence in the converse conclusion that's being made. Say in that paper in neurology, where they're saying red meat is bad from the brain. I'm like, actually, no, the data don't say that. So the burden of proof is on he who is making the claim or she who is making the claim. And so there's a lot of negative claims about red meat. And I think destabilizing those is, and attacking the burden of proof that is on the other is a much more powerful way to go about advancing and opening minds towards red meat, animal-based ketogenic diets, as opposed to making strong claims for which we just don't have evidence because of the reasons I've already explained, because the studies haven't been done.
Thank you all so much for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one. SPG out.